Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Foxy and this is Foxy Books and Planning. Today is my overview and stats for 2019 in terms of my reading. And just so you guys know, my tablet is on the top side of my filming setup and I will be referring to a spreadsheet and Goodreads for a lot of the information. So please bear with me as I reach and toggle between my two kind of data centers. So first off, this was not the best year for me in terms of my reading challenge. This is the first year I've missed my reading challenge since I started doing them back in 2017. My goal was 80 books and I finished 77 of them. Apologies for the jump cuts, I was still having some technical difficulties. So I did have a goal of 80 books and I only managed 77. I was 3 books short and I did do my best to try and hit that goal, but my problem was a lot of my books that came at the end of the year that were on my currently reading list were a little too long for me to get done in the calendar year. In terms of some basic overview stats, I read a total of 23,814 pages across those 77 books. And that is lower from previous years, but part of the reason it's lower is because I did a lot more Audible originals, which may be a 7 to 14 hour audiobook, but because it's not a physical book, there isn't a page number, so Audible normally assigns it 1 or 2 pages in terms of page count. So 23,000 is a little, or 23,800 is a little lower than normal. The shortest book I read this year was 15 pages, which was A Sound of Thunder by Ray Bradbury. It's the short story from Whence We Get the Butterfly Effect. And the longest book that I finished this year was Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson at 1,248 pages. And the average length of book that I completed this year was 309. Again, that's lower because those Audible originals are pulling the average down. I will do a median calculation after I film this and throw up a comment with what the median length of a book of the books I read this year was. In terms of popularity, and just so you know, I'm reading off of my Goodreads year at a glance right now. The most popular book I read in 2019 was The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins. And the least popular book that I read was The History of Science, Antiquity to 1700 with Lawrence M. Princip lecturing. And my average rating for a book this year was 3.9. So that is the Goodreads stuff. Now, I will throw up a link to the Excel spreadsheet that I used this year to keep track of my reading in addition to my Goodreads. It is the same spreadsheet that Emily Fox uses, and I really enjoyed it, especially once I tweaked it to get kind of where I want it to be. So in terms of reading distribution over the month, and I'm going to start throwing some graphs up. So in terms of books read per month, I averaged about 6 books a month, with my highest month being 12 books and my lowest month being 3 books. And my highest month was October, where I got just a ton of stuff done. I did a lot of shorter things that month as well, because that was a month where I managed to do, I got both my Audible originals, for both my free Audible originals, which were like 5 hours a piece. So I was able to get a lot more reading done that month. And then I had 3 books in May, which I'm not quite certain, or actually I had 2 months with 3. I had March and May. Were both 3 book months. I think that's because I was trying to finish longer books, because I know Oathbringer was finished in there, kind of in that date range. But I'd have to look back and see what the exact books were. And I'll throw up a comment if I take the time to figure that out. In terms of pages per month, I averaged about 2,000 pages a month. The actual number is 1,973 pages a month, with my lowest reading month being July at 707 pages. And I think the July was because I was doing a lot of Audible originals that month. So I read 4 books that month, and I think at least 2 of them were Audible originals. Also, in terms of pages per day, I averaged about, well, according to my spreadsheet, I averaged 5 days per book read, with the shortest time being 3 days per book, which was in that really high October, September range, and the lowest or the longest it took was that March and May at 10 days per book. In terms of the actual books, I was actually kind of surprised at my percentages this year. I expected it to be very heavily fantasy and science fiction, and it turned out to be sort of evenly split between fantasy, nonfiction, and mystery. So my largest category was I read 17 fantasy books for 22%. And then my next category was nonfiction at 14 books and 18%. Then mystery at 13 books and 17%. And then the next highest category is science fiction with 14% or 11 books. And so those 4 categories are kind of hovering in the 15 to 20%. And then there's only a handful of books in the other categories. 1 biography, 2 contemporary, 6 horror, 1 memoir, 3 historical fiction, 8 romance, and 1 classic. I was kind of surprised about it. I think it's just I tend to go for mysteries and fantasy interchangeably, but I was kind of surprised, and I think it's also how I was categorizing books in terms of science fiction versus fantasy. But I am kind of happy to see it be evenly split across a couple of genres instead of it just being solely on a single genre. Other things I looked at were format. This was one that did not really surprise me. In total, of my 77 books, 74% of them were audiobooks, 16% were Audible originals. I finished 1 ebook, 5 paperbacks, and 2 hardbacks. And I knew this because audiobooks are my primary mode of consuming literature at the moment because of work and driving and whatnot. Those are the primary times I'm reading or listening to books. And it is one of my goals for 2020 to redistribute that percentage away from the audio sector, because when you if you put Audible originals and audiobooks together, I broke them out because they are considered different. At least to me, they're different, because one is a book that's being read to you, and Audible originals typically tend to be like full productions, or they were intended to be an audiobook. They've never been released as actual books or ebooks. If you put those 2 together, 90% of my reading was audio this year. And I really want to be able to redistribute that and read more of my physical books that I have in my library. Speaking of library, one of the things that I added to the spreadsheet was where did my books come from? And I broke it down between library and my personal collection, be it my shelves, be it books I've acquired or Audible books I've acquired. And I was really happy with this. 38% of my books came from the library and 62% of my books came from my personal collection, which is great for me because it means I'm clearing out the books, or I'm reading what I have and not bringing a whole lot new in. And I'm also utilizing my library to get a lot of new releases and books that I might not be able to find myself, and thus be able to consume them that way. All right. In terms of age groups, no surprise here, 87% of my books were adult age group books, which is what I tend towards. I prefer adult literature. I've discovered that as I have gotten older, which I think is the tendency for most people, is that I find YA and middle grade and children's books to be not my cup of tea anymore. I can read them, but I don't necessarily appreciate them as much as I would have like 2 or 3 years ago. And then 87% of my books were adult books, or what I classify as adult reading. 10% were YA books, and 3% were children's books, which I think means middle grade to me. I'm just gonna check that real quick. Yes. So my two middle grades were R.L. Stine's Audible Original, and then The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. So I'm actually kind of happy with this split. I don't intend to attempt to make it a more even split. I'm quite happy reading primarily adult books. In terms of page lengths, my average page length seems to be around, or no, Goodreads told me it was 309, which the graph you're about to see will also substantiate that. The majority of the books I read, 36%, were in the 300 to 399 range. I had Oathbringer, which was my one outlier, at over 1,000 pages, and then it's a pretty normal distribution, other than the less than 100 pages, which the Audible originals come into that again, which 16% of my books were under 100 pages or were essentially Audible originals or short stories. In terms of year published, this was one that I had never thought to look at, but was really interesting to me. So the way the year published category works is it has every decade from the 30s to the 90s, and then there's a category for anything older than 1920. And then more recent, the last 2 decades are broken down into 2000 to 05, to 06 to 2010, 2011 to 2015, 2016, 2017, and then 2018 and 2019. And when I looked at that, I read at least one book from every decade except the 1980s this year. In every category. I shouldn't say every decade. But the majority of my books were concentrated in 2018 releases, with the next largest categories being 2016 to 2017 and 2019. And I think this comes from I was just getting into BookTube, and I was starting to really get into it and start to take recommendations from other booktubers, where a lot of those books and a lot of the videos I was watching were from last year. And so I had a lot of things where I was playing catch up, trying to read the books that came out last year so I could speak to them. I'm actually kind of surprised about the number of books I read from 2019. I didn't expect to read that many new releases this year, but I think when you put the free Audible originals and some of the major releases, it kind of bumps that number up. But overall, I'm kind of happy with the spread. I'd really like to read some more older books, but looking at my TBR, I have a lot of new releases for 2020 coming, and I have a lot of books for my science fiction and fantasy reading that I've been doing, which most of the books I have left are either very old or from the 2000s at some point. But maybe I'll get lucky and I'll see a similar spread next year. As stated before, my average rating was a 3.9, which doesn't really surprise me. Most of my books got 4 stars. I did have 20 5-star ratings, 2 1 stars, which are books that I DNF'd, 2 2 stars, 19 3 stars, and yeah, that's a pretty good distribution. I try not to read books that I don't think I'll like, and if I end up not liking them, if I finish the book, I'm gonna end up giving it 2 stars, because 1 star I basically exclusively reserve for DNFs. And in case anyone is curious, my 2 DNFs for the year The First Conspiracy by Brad Metzer and Kingsbane by Claire Legrand, which I talk about in my reading wrap-ups for October and November respectively, or I think it might be September and October. But I was actually really happy to only DNF 2 books this year. In terms of my authors, I'm not quite as proud about my author split. I could have done better, but I should preface this by saying that I don't look at who the author is before I start reading a book. I normally look at the title, the cover, and the synopsis. So I don't know half the time who the author is unless it's one of my most favorite authors like Joe Hill or Drew Hayes, that kind of person where I already know ahead of time who the author is. But a lot of times I go into this not knowing who the author is at all. So I just read what most speaks to me. So in terms of authors, almost perfectly split, 50-50 male-female. I read 52% male and 48% female. Go me. There is a category in here for non-binary. I couldn't find any authors who readily identified themselves as non-binary, but it's something that I will be probably on the lookout for to see if I can find one to read for the next year. In terms of where authors are from, most of my books were written by people from the United States and the United Kingdom. It's just how it works sometimes. That accounts for 98% of the books I read, the United States and the United Kingdom. And then I have authors from Canada, China, Ireland, Poland, and Singapore. And with that, I was so when you look at my splits between the United States and the UK, I have 73% of my authors were US based. And the way I did this was I looked at where the author currently lives and where they are born. So if Goodreads tells me the person was born in Sussex and now lives in London, they're a UK author. If they were born in the UK but now live in the US, I look at where they went to school. So if they went to school in the UK, then they are a UK author. If they went to school in the US, they're then a US-based author. Because sometimes it's difficult to tell where authors are from. So also going along with that there is a category for author's race, which again, I don't know who my authors are until I finish the book and I look at them on Goodreads. So 92% of the authors I read this year were white and 8% were people of color, which in this case is any non-white authors. In terms of translation, I only read 1 book in translation this year. Everything else was not in translation. And my last thing, which I don't have a chart for, was my most read authors of the year, because I wanted to look to see how many books I read from certain authors. My most read author of 2019 is Drew Hayes. I read 7 of his books this year, which makes up 9% of my total book reading for the year. The next, kind of the top 5. Top 5. So I had Drew Hayes at 7. Melinda Mullett, who writes the Whiskey Business Cozy Mystery series. I read 3 of those books. I read 3 Molly Harper books this year, 2 Anthony Horowitz books, and 2 Ruth Ware books. So that is all of the stats. So I wanted to go through and look at some of my other kind of things that I think people might find interesting. So in terms of, I'm not going to call them best books of the year because I am not qualified to say if these were the best or worst books of the year, because I didn't read enough books to consider them the best or worst books of the year. But my personal favorite books for the year, and I'm looking at my list of books, would probably be is that book 2? I'm going to go with We Are Legion, We Are Bob by Dennis E. Taylor. The 7.5 Lives of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Tartan, and The War Game by Louis McMaster Bujold. So those are my top 3 for the year. And basically what I'm basing that off of is scrolling through my list of books that I read, which are the books that jump out at me as my favorite books, that if I could spend another year reading just those books, those are the ones that I would read. So yeah. And most of those are parts of series, which doesn't really surprise me because I'm also planning on continuing those series later in the year, and I am looking forward to Stuart Tartan's new book coming out soon. In terms of dishonorable mentions or least favorite books I read in the year, my 2 DNFs are definitely there. The First Conspiracy by Brad Metzer and Kingsbane by Claire Legrand. Both of these I was really excited to read them. They seemed really interesting and they just let me down, mostly to do with the writing styles of both. Other dishonorable mentions, or my other dishonorable mention would probably be looking at my 2 stars. The Beholder by Anna Bright. That one was just one of those where I was like, I'm gonna make it through. I want to know what happens, but at the same time, nothing happens. Only 2? I could have sworn I had more 2s. I had 2 2s, so where's my other 2? Oh, City of Falling Angels by John Brent was my other 2-star. That was a nonfiction book. Again, most of these were the writing style where there was this promise of this really interesting, really driving plot, and the pacing and writing style just let it down. So let's see. That is it for my reading stats. I will include links, I think I said at the beginning, to the Excel spreadsheet that I use down below. And please let me know what you think. I would love to hear your comments or thoughts. And I hope to do this again next year. So I will see you all in my next video. Bye.